Hey, what's up? So today I want to talk about how space combat actually works. Spoiler warning, it's not at all like you see in the movies. Also, how do you feel about YouTube intros? I'm asking for a friend, but coincidentally, check this out. Combat in space is always portrayed kind of weirdly in fiction. Star Wars comes to mind, which is basically just what if World War II but in space, complete with ideas which are absolutely incomprehensible from a physics perspective. Most sci-fi media has a similar attitude, and that's fine. Not everything has to be a giant nerd fest. A good story's a good story, so long as the universe it's set in is at least vaguely consistent and it's not full of plot holes. I usually refer to these types of movies and TV shows as high-tech fantasy rather than sci-fi. You know, the ones that go for space vibes without going hard on the scientific accuracy. The ones with fighter spaceships that fly around like planes despite space being a vacuum, and launch projectiles which fall downwards despite there not being a downwards, and have capital ships lumbering around slowly meeting each other oriented as if there's a universal up direction in space so they can broadside each other, rather than the more realistic scenario of obliterating each other from thousands of miles out and then the winner whizzing past the debris of the loser at a relative velocity of like 30 kilometers per second or whatever. Anyway, here's a sense of how warfare really goes down in space. We can divide space warfare scenarios into 4 domains: space to surface, surface to surface, surface to space, and space to space. For space to surface attacks, your weapons are going to go down towards a planet with the flow of gravity, and you're able to use the curvature of the planet against your on-world opponent to launch a surprise attack, unless your opponent has sensor systems across the planet or stationed in orbit to see your attack coming ahead of time. To attack a location on Earth specifically, your weapons are going to have to travel through the atmosphere and deal with the heating you get as a result, so you'll have to bear that in mind. Viable attack options include ballistic strikes with explosive or nuclear payloads. Get on an inclined orbit above the Earth and you can drop these on essentially any location on Earth if the orbital timing lines up, and if you have a constellation of them, you could hit anywhere at any time. If you're attacking from a high orbit or an interplanetary trajectory, your strike has a lot of time for gravity to work on it, so it's going to come in faster and be harder to deal with. If you'd like to precisely erase a single building without destroying the entire block or glassing an entire city, you could try a high-mass kinetic weapon, basically just a lump of stuff you drop on someone. This can be as simple as a tungsten rod with a tiny deorbiting thruster on the tip and a couple of fins so it can steer towards the target. Give it a push out of orbit and you can guarantee you'll be giving a guy stood in a very specific location a very big headache. Then again, you could just push an asteroid into an Earth collision if you really wanted to do some big damage. If you're a generic cartoon evil villain cosplayer, you might consider an orbital laser. Whilst technically feasible, this sort of thing is probably using more energy than it takes to power my will to live on a Monday, so you might need a nuclear reactor in orbit to actually make that work. EMPs, or electromagnetic pulses, are useful if you're trying to screw with the planetside enemy force. Nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere generate gamma rays, which knock electrons out of the molecules in the atmosphere, which spiral along the Earth's magnetic field lines and dump a gigantic energy surge into any sensitive electronics over a vast area on the ground. Did your eyes glaze over for that explanation? I bet they did. So whilst not directly killing anybody, I wouldn't want to be relying heavily on electronics at the time. You wouldn't want to be flying a battery-powered helicopter while that happens. Deploying troops from the surface to orbit is also an option. Doing so is almost as easy as kicking them out the back of a plane, with the notable exception of needing to kick them at a very specific velocity so they don't end up landing on the wrong continent, and also needing substantial heat shielding to protect them from being vaporized, and a much more substantial method of slowing down than just a parachute, and also an oxygen supply. Okay, it's not that similar. One more thing you might consider is denying the on-world force the ability to access space. If the planet has a lot of satellites in orbit, you can induce a barrier that prevents them from leaving the planet's surface by destroying the satellites. The mass of the satellites doesn't just vanish when you blow them up, all the bits and pieces keep orbiting, just on slightly different trajectories from each other that all spread out over time. The more of them there are, the more likely each of them is to hit another satellite and make even more debris. If the planet has enough satellites spread over roughly the same altitude, blowing only a few of them up could induce a planetary barrier of randomly orbiting debris pieces the size of dust particles, which would shred anything you try and put into orbit. Now, the particles do experience a tiny bit of atmospheric drag, even up in orbit, and they would also bounce off of each other and deorbit themselves that way, so an accidental instance of this happening would eventually fix itself. But if you didn't want to directly fight an on-world force for whatever reason, you, the force in space presumably, could maintain a barrier around a planet by constantly constantly adding debris to the barrier and starve the people on the planet out if you're a bunch of psychotic fucks. The surface-to-surface domain is an umbrella term for the usual land, sea and air warfare you're probably more familiar with, although a fighting force with an interplanetary level of force projection would have some extra options for how to tackle certain situations compared to just modern militaries. If you need to drop troops somewhere, you could always use orbit-capable transport and just use it suborbitally. You can get anywhere on Earth within like an hour this way, although the logistics of this are a little screwy. A rocket has so many little valves and connections that you generally don't want to leave it standing full of propellant and oxidizer for a particularly long period of time. The likelihood of leaks happening, as well as the need to keep the oxidizer at cryogenic temperatures, and the fact the entire thing is basically a giant bomb waiting to go off at the slightest hint of a spark, means nobody's ever going to likely have one of these just fully fueled and sitting around unless the technology it uses is a bit different from what we currently use. There's also stuff like hybrid suborbital bomber space planes, which could hypothetically come in handy, but on the surface we all know what war is like anyway, so whatever, I'll move on. The domain of surface to space reflects a lot of the aspects of space to surface. If you want to knock out something in space, you can use ballistics, lasers, kinetic rounds launched from a railgun, EMPs, you can just send troops up in orbit-capable transport, you could even do the whole Kessler syndrome thing again and deny them access to the planet, although you're locking yourself out of the entire universe doing that, so maybe not the best idea. Ultimately, I think being on-world is a bit of a losing position in an interplanetary conflict. It gives you more limited resources, more limited room to maneuver, and every time you attack, you're doing so against the pull of gravity. It's tremendously costly to send something useful out of the Earth's orbital influence, but giving a big rock a push and letting it fall in does a lot of damage and doesn't cost much of anything. If you do manage to get something into space, congrats, but now you're doing space-to-space combat with probably 1/1000th of the equipment they already have floating around up there waiting to obliterate you. If you want to do a Sun Tzu Art of Space War type thing, a good piece of advice might be to take Obi-Wan's suggestion and seek out the high ground.
Ming Dynasty got me acting unwise.
Space-to-space combat is where stuff gets interesting. First, it's important to remember that things don't work like they do in the movies. In space, there's no air, so you can't just move some control surfaces around to alter your course. There's nothing to push against. Things are always moving on a set trajectory unless you activate a thruster and use propellant to alter that trajectory. This makes evasive maneuvers in space really costly. The jet engines that planes use to fly on the Earth can react with the oxygen in the atmosphere to produce thrust, but given the lack of atmosphere in space, you have to bring the oxygen with you, so you're lugging all this extra mass around. There are some upsides to rockets. I mean, they're simpler in some ways, they're potentially very powerful, but they're inherently low efficiency by comparison to jets. Running out of fuel is something to be very concerned about. Also, in space you're contending with orbital mechanics. Every time you alter course to avoid an incoming missile or whatever, you need to spend even more fuel after the fact, correcting your new trajectory that's no longer pointing in the direction you want it to point in. You wouldn't want to accidentally deviate from your heading and miss the planet you're trying to get to, or if you're in orbit you wouldn't want to accidentally deorbit yourself and burn up in the atmosphere. On top of all this, the incoming fire is going to be very fast. Without atmospheric drag, kinetic rounds will be going muzzle velocity all the way to the target. In fact, it could be substantially worse than that. Imagine if a ship is orbiting the planet the opposite direction to you and it fires at you. Those bullets are going dozens of kilometers per second when they hit you. That's going to be rough. Now imagine if that's a missile which can home in on your ship. No amount of maneuvering is going to fix this situation for you. So I think maneuvering isn't going to be the main solution that people go for. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this. Alright, thanks, back to the video. Another thing to bear in mind is thermodynamics. Here's what I mean by that. On Earth, let's say you're sitting in a car, your body heat is going to gradually want to heat up the air in the car since your body is metabolizing, doing work to keep you alive. Non-living systems do this too. Sit in a small room with a beefy computer on all day like I do when I'm writing, recording and editing my retarded little videos, and you might notice that the room temperature increases over time. Any system that uses energy is going to lose some efficiency where the system meets the outside world. It's going to rub up against the nearby particles in some way, causing them to move in random directions, which is what heat is. Every system is subject to this. Everything loses energy as heat. No system is 100% efficient, unless the system is a heater, I guess. A heater's 100% efficient? I don't fucking know. Anyway, in space there's a substantial issue to keep in mind, which is that heat is just going to keep building up and building up and building up until you can get rid of it. Eventually, when you're sitting in a car or in a room in your house or whatever, the heat dissipates because you're in direct contact with matter which is colder and wants to equalize the temperature with you. Your car is in contact with the ground below, it's in contact with the air all around the car, but what's a spaceship in contact with? Nothing. How's it going to get rid of all that heat? The only way is to radiate it, and radiating heat is by far the least efficient way of doing it. You know how metal glows when you heat it up? Technically everything glows like that. It's just that the hotter things get the higher frequency energy that they glow with. Things at room temperature are cooler, so they glow with lower frequency light, which is infrared. But everything is glowing all the time, you just can't see it because, I guess, evolution thought it would be dumb to have us be flashbanged by everything every time we open our eyes. Anyway, a spaceship is going to boil you alive and fry all your electronics unless you get rid of that heat. So it needs to radiate, glow, to get rid of that heat. And if it's glowing really brightly in the infrared, you're going to be able to see it from very, very far away. We can see tiny asteroids and stuff from Earth, and they're just re-radiating the sun's light. You can see something a lot smaller if it's actively glowing very brightly. If you had a handful of infrared detectors scattered across the solar system, you could track basically every spaceship in the system simultaneously. Each one's like a lighthouse, they wouldn't be hard to see. If you do want to try and go for stealth, there are a few options, but none of them are that great. You can just hold all of it in and let the interior heat up, a bit like eating 8 cans of beans, a couple gallons of ice cream, and washing it down with 14 pints of coffee before heading into your court hearing to see if you get visitation rights to see your kids. You're going to be able to hold it in for a certain period of time, but sooner or later it's going to start doing some internal damage, and when it all finally starts spilling out in public, the consequences are going to be catastrophic. A slightly better option is using a heat sink, which is basically a block of metal or some other dense bullshit that you can put in contact with the hot systems that you want to cool down so it can soak up as much of the internal heat as possible before you dump it out of the spacecraft and load up the next one. This works, but only for a while. Sooner or later you do have to dump the thing out, and then you have a brightly glowing hunk of metal right next to your spaceship, which immediately gives you away. Realistically, spaceships have radiators which get rid of the excess heat in a safe and responsible way. A lot of the panels on the International Space Station are actually radiators. The best sci-fi ships are usually the ones that show radiators because they're trying to be realistic about it. In reality, our futuristic spaceships are probably going to need radiators. Arguably, you could make a spaceship with a radiator which radiates away from the thing you're trying to remain stealthy towards, but that breaks down the second there's multiple threats in multiple directions that you're trying to hide from simultaneously. Could you somehow radiate heat in narrow directions and keep the directions you're radiating in pointed away from the marks you're trying to stay invisible to? Maybe? I don't think so. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I certainly don't know how you would do that, and I imagine the system would be ridiculously complicated anyway. The short version of all of this is, you're probably best to assume that everyone can see you and that you can see everyone, and that most ships also ain't dodging shit. So on that basis, what are you meant to do if you're getting attacked? Well, the best idea is to have countermeasures. Point defense cannons are a good one. They're just rapid-fire guns that can autonomously target and destroy missiles before they hit you, and do so from a distance. Whipple shields are a good idea too. If you're getting hit with kinetic rounds, having multiple layers of material to spread out the impact is a really good idea. Whipple shields break up impact material into smaller pieces, which break up further and further with each layer, and sometimes the design of them can redirect the energy sideways. Although projectiles that are energetic enough are probably going to get through regardless. One good thing about being shot at with kinetics though is that at least they can't change course once they're on their way, so I don't know, maybe minor dodging maneuvers might end up being slightly useful after all. Decoys, like the chaff and flares used by fighter jets, might work to some degree, although I'm less sure about that. I feel like missiles in the space era will be controlled by AI rather than being some simple heat-seeking design, and an AI would be much harder to trick. You could actively jam a missile's signal though if the AI is remotely controlling the missile from a mothership. As always, EMPs would be useful, although strategically using Faraday cages and hardening your electrical systems would help to mitigate their effects. The thing I haven't mentioned yet is lasers. Direct energy weapons can kill at light speed, so dealing with them effectively is definitely going to be a good idea. I feel like these are the trump card when it comes to space warfare. I could imagine a scenario where two powers have all their respective space navies' direct energy weapons pointed at each other at all times, and all it takes is one accidentally flipped switch for mutually assured destruction, and millions of spaceships cease to exist almost immediately. Point defense lasers would be a useful way to supplement your point defense cannons as well. Definitely quicker and probably more accurate. There are some ways to defend against energy weapons though. You could make your ship highly reflective, although this definitely wouldn't help you stay hidden, but if you're leaning into the whole lack of stealth thing in the first place, then I guess that kinda doesn't matter. If you're getting attacked, you could also spin your spacecraft as well. That'll distribute the energy over as much surface area as possible, which is kinda funny. Oh my god, we're being shot at! Initiate the gentle rotation procedure. I'm sure there's other things you could do. I don't know, maybe circulate coolant through the hole, maybe shoot clouds of reflective dust particles out into space to hide behind. I'm not claiming to have all the answers here, but I'm hoping to give you a good idea of what space warfare is actually like. So to summarize, when war breaks out, planets suck ass, go to space, get the high ground, find cover if you can. I imagine hiding behind an asteroid in a planetary ring system is probably as good as it's gonna get, but ultimately just assume that everyone can see you, make your ship very reflective, polish it to a shine, just outrageously, fabulously reflective. You want it to look like that f***ing bean thing in Chicago. And lastly, just cover the goddamn thing in lasers and point defense cannons. If you still die after all that, then it's probably a skill issue. Alright, thanks for watching guys. Like and subscribe if you want. I've got a bunch of cool YouTube membership perks if you're interested in joining the channel, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.